So hello, everyone, and welcome to our meeting of Eyes on Gaza. Israel attempts to erase Palestinian culture through sheer force have been the topic of several of our meetings. We witnessed the destruction of cultural centers, libraries, theaters, and infrastructure, and have also heard about the efforts to resist this erasure from poets and playwrights in Gaza and their allies, translators and directors outside of Gaza. Today, we will consider a different dimension of the relationship between culture and genocide. We will focus on the power of cultural institutions and funding structures to determine what can be shown, whose voices can be heard, and whose work becomes visible, and consequently, on the ways in which cultural production can itself participate in processes of erasure or, alternatively, resist them. Our guest today is Dr. Aïcha Revellat, an art historian at the University of Basel and an activist whose research and political interventions engage directly with these issues. In Basel, Aïcha was one of the organizers of Cinematic Counterarchives of Palestine, Memory, Erasure, Resistance, which brought together Palestinian films and filmmakers to Swiss audiences. The series presented cinema as a space of memory, resistance, and cultural survival, while also asking how archives and artistic practices can challenge processes of erasure. Thank you very much, Aïcha, for coming to talk to us today about complicity and conscious culture in genocide. And we'll hear from you over the next 8 minutes.
Thank you so much, Leo. I will share my screen now. So I'm really happy to be here, and I will just very briefly give you an overview of what I want to talk about in these short few minutes. I would like to talk about institutions and a few concrete examples of complicity and also resistance. And maybe I will start with what complicity looks like in the cultural field. It rarely announces itself, and I think that's what's so dangerous about it. It arrives as silence, as procedural caution, as the language of neutrality. It's complex. There's both sides. The university is apolitical. These phrases feign objectivity where there is none. And they have become, as my dear colleague Peter Burley put it so well, violent speech acts. Apolitical, he said, is a violent illusion afforded to the privilege. To be neutral is to be on the side of the oppressor. And for everything that I will share with you is just from my own experience with working in or for these institutions. And I will try to tell you some of the strategies that some comrades and colleagues of mine are working on, trying to deal with this situation. Complicity, of course, also takes a more organized form. We call this artwashing. So the use of art and culture to launder the image of a state engaged in systematic violence, to project, in the case of Israel, cosmopolitanism and democratic normalcy while the violence continues. So very concretely, in 2005, the Israeli government launched a formal campaign called Brand Israel, and artists who accepted state funding signed a contract specifying that I quote, the service provider is aware that the purpose of ordering services from him is to promote the policy interests of the state of Israel via culture and art, end of quote. At the same time, the contract required that the service provider, and I quote again, not present himself as an agent or representative of the ministry, end of quote. Culture, as one official put it, I quote again, is a propaganda tool of the first rank. So I'm sure you are all aware how important academia is for state propaganda, but I would argue that art and culture are just as relevant. And the forms of art washing take various forms. There's all these terms, pinkwashing, the promotion of Israel's relative tolerance of LGBTQ plus rights, for example, or film festivals. Obviously, film is a very extremely powerful tool, especially in place that is, Palestine is the most filmed place in the world, historically seen. And Israeli cinema regularly wins prizes at Cannes, Venice, and Berlin, with films that often present self-critical, complex portrayals of Israeli society and thereby construct an image of a culturally sophisticated, reflective state. And I think that really speaks to, I work, in Switzerland, France, these very white Western ideals. And so let me, I don't know if I can. So the most important event in the art world is the Venice Biennale. And in 2024, the ANGA, Art Not Genocide Alliance. This is an international coalition of artists, curators, writers, and cultural workers. They're anonymous, have written a letter that was signed by many, many, many people, over 25,000 signatories, to exclude the Israeli pavilion from the biennial. Why? Because the Venice Biennale is based on the principle of nation states, and every pavilion is usually founded directly by the government that it represents. So that's more than maybe in other cases where I would say this also goes not just for Venice, but in Venice it's very explicitly so. That the artist representing the country represents the country, and after this action, the Israeli pavilion was forced to close, even though the official declaration from the artist Ruth Patia was that she would close it in respect because she wanted to wait until all the hostages were released. And the pavilion didn't officially close. It was still shown to journalists, and she sold her whole exhibition, her whole works afterwards for an undisclosed amount of money. By the way, and I think that's really interesting, and it really speaks to how art washing works, the exhibition that was planned and installed was about motherhood, about fertility, and I think for a lot of activists, the fact that there was a genocide going on that was specifically targeting mothers and children and fertility, that was a particularly kind of perverted aspect of that event. So ANGA continues because in 2026, the biennial happened again, obviously, in the spring. And Israel was moved to the Arsenal's Weapons Room G. So they officially renovated the Israeli pavilion, but they gave them another place where the artist Beluz Simeon Fainaru presented The Rose of Nothingness. And I will just leave that title as is with you, because I think, again, it speaks for itself. A work that celebrates Israeli drip irrigation technology through metaphors of tears and Kabbalah. No comment. This opened, so one could say nothing has really changed. What we have seen, however, is that there was a national strike during the biennial. So it was not just artists and cultural workers, it was all kinds of people. Some pavilions couldn't open because they literally didn't have enough, because it was it turned into a strike that all kinds of workers in Italy and Venice participated in. So we can see, I think, a change in people's perception of art washing and how we perceive that. There is also historical precedent, but maybe I cannot really go into that now, but I do think it matters. But you are very welcome to look up. ANGA has a website that is quite extensive with information where you can look up historical precedents, just such as South Africa or the case of Chile, where national pavilions have been excluded, actually. This year was a specific uproar also because Russia also had a pavilion. So it's not something that ANGA doesn't target specific artists, it doesn't target anyone, but it was always about excluding the state and the perpetrator and not targeting a specific individual artist. So that's maybe important to mention as well. Okay, so Lior has already mentioned Cinematic Counterarchives of Palestine. This is a project that I initiated and co-organized with colleagues from different departments at the University of Basel. It did actually, as you can see on the presentation, not happen in the end at the university itself for various reasons. And one of the reasons is that the University of Basel is officially apolitical and has some members of that university have judged that what we have organized was not apolitical. The films that we showed, I don't know if you can read it, but they're from Rosalind Nashashibi, from Emily Jassir, Ivan Yakshi, and Noor Abed. They all under the subject of the archive and insistence that what was there in Palestine existed, that it matters, and that the claim that there was nothing there before is a lie. And cinema in this context becomes a space of memory and resistance. Yes, and the institutional pressure, I think, has shown to me personally the limits also of what institutions can do and how fast we can work to really resist, and has led me, amongst other things, to found a new organization together with my colleagues, Rebecca Lamarche-Vadel, who is a curator, and Ayla Jorej, who has studied international law. Yes, one thing that we want to do is to organize projects at the intersection of art, research, and political engagement. And we want to do this outside of the institutional limitations, pressures, and censorship, which is something that we don't really have time to talk about now, but that is obviously within everything that I just said.
Ido here is asking, first of all, he's thanking you for those initiatives that are very crucial and for your willingness to talk to us today. And he's asking if you can elaborate a bit about ANGA, its activity, and perhaps how it came into being, and a kind of perhaps infrastructure that supports the organization, if there is one.
So ANGA is independent. It's not funded by anyone or any organization outside of it. It's really just people who work in the cultural sector internationally coming together. And the initiative, it grew out of, maybe you are aware of the Art Forum letter that I didn't talk about today, but this was a letter published in Art Forum, which was, no longer is, but was the most important publication for contemporary art in the art world. And that letter really soon after October 7 demanded a ceasefire, basically. And there was a lot of, and thousands of artists and cultural workers signed this letter. There has been a huge outcry from pro-Israel lobbies, and a lot of people have lost their job, like the editor-in-chief of Art Forum, for example, David Velasquez. And a lot of artists have come under immense pressure. They've had their exhibitions cancelled, they can't get funding, etc., just for a signature. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think this had already happened when ANGA was born. Okay? So the idea was, so if we don't want to, or maybe it's not enough to just write a letter, we need to organize and we need to do something concrete. And I do think that tackling the Venice Biennale was intentional in the sense that this is the core event for the art world.
And we have a question here from Ayelet. She's wondering if the art world, or if the European art world addresses European complicity in the genocide? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult because I also use the term art world, but who is the art world, you know? I think in general, I mentioned it maybe in the very beginning, there's a lot of silence. And there's obviously good reason for that silence, because it's very difficult to speak up, because people who speak up, they face really severe consequences. Like I said, they lose their jobs, they lose their livelihoods, they cannot get an exhibition. There's a lot of self-censorship going on, I would say. I cannot speak for the whole of Europe, but you know, here in Switzerland, I can count them on one hand, the ones who are very vocal about Palestine and the genocide, and who are willing to speak about it publicly. I think it's changing a little bit, but it's still, there's a lot of fear and a lot of backlash, and I think that is intentional.
Mm-hmm. Ido asks here, how was this activity, how is this activism received? How does the artistic establishment react to, you mentioned frictions with the University of Basel, but perhaps other platforms and spheres?
Yes, so I would say, yeah, of course, my case is a bit maybe specific because I'm kind of in the intersection between academia, the university that is kind of one body, and then the quote unquote art world with its own institutions. And I would say there is more backlash from the institution that is the university, because the art world is also much more kind of spread out and it's not so concentrated. But in general, you know, people, they don't love it. They don't want it. They know it creates problems, and everybody is always, you know, there's since the pandemic, there's a lot of economical issues also in the art world. So people are really afraid to lose funding. Activists are not, very popular, I'm afraid.
So have there been alternative venues, alternative spaces? I don't know, has there been like a development of a new field or a new scene, or has it gone underground, or how does it look?
I would say, yes, there are initiatives, you know, and I think that's what we wanted to do, for example, with the Cinematic Counterarchives, or that we're trying to do now with Commons Calling. But in general, money is a real issue, and it's what you know, organizing exhibitions is expensive, shipping artworks is really expensive. Being an artist is expensive. Being an art historian is expensive, because there's really no money in these fields. And I think that's also a tool that becomes a tool. We become quite an easy target, you know, because people who can't really afford to turn down, like saying no can be really costly. Is what my experience is.
We're out of time, but there's one last question. We often hear that boycott should target you know, the economic sector and businesses, and that artistic and cultural exchanges should still remain feasible, open, possible. And in this context, there's a question of the political goal of this kind of activism, of the activism that you presented, like Angas and the other platforms.
Yes, thank you for that question, because that's obviously kind of the argument that we receive a lot. Art should be free. Art is, you know, here to help, and art, you know, is not political. And art, but like I showed you, it's just not true. Art is political. Art is always political, and it is used specifically in that context, which is, you know, not something I made up. It's provable. So as long as art is being used as propaganda, as long as art art has influence, cultural influence is not separate from politics. So it's not about saying art should not be free, it's saying art cannot be free in this sense. So it's not possible to make a separation saying we're only boycotting, banks and weapon manufacturers, because that's not the only the only entity in that system. Every entity plays a role, and I would argue that art and culture plays a huge role within that system, and that is why it should be boycotted. It's not against individuals, again.
Thank you very much, Aïcha, for this illuminating talk and presentation, and for bringing all this activity to the forefront and to our awareness. Thank you all for coming to this meeting, and we'll meet again next week, כרגיל, שני וחמישי. So we say goodbye today, and thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.